Welcome to a historical noodle, a forum where discussions about different historical figures and many other topics take place. I'm Ha, your guide and professional rambler for the journey, and I'm glad that you're on it with me. As a Vietnamese queer person, it's embarrassing to admit that my entire education on queer history only comes from Western media and sources. Even though I've always wanted to understand queerness in my own culture, I either don't find enough well-documented references from Vietnamese authors on the topic of Vietnamese queerness, or find too many materials produced by Western academics and NGOs with a white savior undertone. How strange it is to know almost everything about Western queer culture, yet not think about your own. However, a Christmas supper from last year challenged my understanding of queerness in Vietnamese culture. A friend of mine invited me to her friend's house, and we had a brief conversation about queer elements in Vietnamese arts and folklore, as well as our navigating life as Vietnamese queers living in the West but raised in Vietnamese culture. Since that supper, it took me a while to reflect and research, and the fruit of my learning process is presented in this video. My aim is to demonstrate that queerness is present in many aspects of Vietnamese culture, and this queerness that is hidden in plain sight challenges Western assumption about Vietnam as lacking queerness, while at the same time refuting the belief that queerness is a foreign import into Vietnam. In the first part, I'll briefly explain what queer theory means and the limits of my framework when adopting Western queer theory as the basis of my argument. The second part of my video will explore the overemphasis on heterosexuality and cisgendered narratives in Vietnamese society, as well as French colonial racism and homophobia. The last part of the analysis will be dedicated to locating queerness in Vietnamese culture using examples from religion, folklore, and performing arts. As a Western trained scholar, it's incredibly difficult not to reference Western feminist and queer studies in this analysis. Academia is a Western institution after all, and Westocentric standards unfortunately hinder our understanding of queerness in non-Western settings. By using queer theory as my framework, I acknowledge my personal bias in this analysis and the limits of my knowledge in the understanding of Vietnamese queer lives and realities. In queer theory, identities are social constructs, and by using queer as a category of analysis, queer theory analyzes the role of discourse in the construction of these identities and challenges the discursive power system which gave birth to these identities in the first place. Here, I reference Michel Foucault's L'Histoire de la Sexualité, which is considered one of the foundational works of queer studies. Although I'm aware of the vastness and multidimensionality of the term queer, my definition of this term stems from queer and gender studies as theorized by Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and Audre Lorde. For the sake of simplicity, I'll define queer as anything deviating from the norms and challenging the dominant and the legitimate. My usage of queer will encompass all things related to sexuality, gender performance, and gender identity in this video. Growing up in Vietnam, I learned about so many Vietnamese national myths and gender and sexuality norms. The originary myth of the Vietnamese people, also known as the Lạc Long Quân and Âu Cơ myth, features a heterosexual couple with defined gendered characteristics, even though Lạc Long Quân is portrayed as a dragon and Âu Cơ a fairy. In my previous video on Trần Hưng Đạo, I analyzed the folk saying tháng 8 giỗ cha, tháng 3 giỗ mẹ, which carries a certain heteronormative connotation as the family is seen as composed of a father and a mother. Within the confines of my family, I had to learn about male personality or nam tính in Vietnamese, which includes providing for the family, being responsible and reliable, and the female personality, which is nữ tính, which is all about being soft spoken, being beautiful in a feminine way, and being polite. And my consciousness was shaped by a rigid heteronormative and cisgendered framework. My dad used to joke about me bringing a guy minister home to insinuate that I would have to eventually perform the female gender role and bring honor to our family through marriage to a rich man. Nope. This heteronormative vision of the family is also reflected in Vietnamese public space. As a kid, I used to see many posters promoting the cultured family, which was made up of a man, a woman, and 1 to 2 child or children. This public display of the cultured family by the Vietnamese government was part of the nation rebuilding project kick-started by the Đổi mới policies of the 1980s, or modernization policies, in the aftermath of the Civil War, and to rebuild the nation was to focus on rebuilding the family. In my childhood, there were many stigmatizing hearsays about homosexuals in Vietnam. They were often seen as ill people, and homosexuality, which is đồng tính in Vietnamese, was considered a disease. In the early 2000s, many advertisements, public service announcements, and billboards urged the fight against HIV and AIDS, drug use, alcoholism, and prostitution, which were deemed social evils or tệ nạn xã hội. Interestingly, it was a common belief that homosexuality originated from these social evils as the Vietnamese economy started opening up to the international market and young people started partying and consuming Western media through television, cinema, and the internet. Queerness in general was seen as a foreign import, and the blame was even placed on overseas Vietnamese or the Viet Kieu for introducing social evils into mainland Vietnamese society. I often heard the adults say bị gay or bị les when gossiping about a queer person. Bị in Vietnamese serves as an auxiliary to build a passive voice, which carries a negative causative connotation and is used in the context of illness. For example, when you say someone is sick, you say anh ta, chị ta bị ốm, bị bệnh. Not only does the use of the passive voice imply that queerness is a disease, it also robs Vietnamese queers of their own agency, as if queerness just magically happens to them out of the blue. I was at times the object of the stigmatization of queerness when I was younger. In kindergarten, I had short hair and enjoyed boyish activities, such as playing construction games and football, and the adults would repeatedly tell the joke, các cụ nặn nhầm, as to say that I was born into the wrong gender, and I deviated from the gender assigned to me at birth. In secondary school, I played football and hung out with the guys all the time, and when seeing my strange hobbies, my classmates distorted my last name to call me a homosexual or đồng tính in Vietnamese, while others called me BD, which is the equivalent of the F insult in English. The BD insult is actually a Vietnamese version of the original French word pédéraste, introduced by French colonists during the French occupation of Vietnam. Now I'm a little bit older, yet it seems to have yet to escape the heteronormative nightmare. Whenever I come back to Vietnam to visit my family, my relatives' first questions would be, and I translate from Vietnamese, do you have a boyfriend? Nope. And are you marrying a husband? Nope. Or a typical answer would just be an awkward shrug and nervous laughter. It would be an incomplete analysis of queerness in Vietnam without discussing French colonization and its impact on the locals' perception of queerness. In French colonial and medical and travel writings, Vietnamese natives were portrayed as ambiguous in terms of gender and sexuality, as well as having a penchant for homosexuality. And this ambiguity was considered a vice in the colonial gaze. However, other colonial accounts, mostly from metropolitan French writers, blamed pederasty on the Chinese and overseas French colonists for having introduced it into Vietnam and advocated a white savior project to protect the pure Vietnamese from moral decay through Western education. Here, you can see that Vietnam was represented in the French colonial imagination as a virgin territory and a land of vices for French colonists to indulge in their homoerotic fantasies and save the natives from their backwardness. Many Vietnamese students who had completed their studies in France returned to Vietnam and brought with them numerous European trends and modes of consumption, such as shorter hairstyles and the use of cosmetic products for men and women, which led to the blurring of gender. These new trends were met with mixed reception in Vietnam, especially from the new bilingual bourgeois intelligentsia. Disapproving of these new gender-blurring trends, the bilingual Vietnamese bourgeoisie translated 20th century Western scholarship on queerness and homosexuality, portrayed as diseases and psychological dysfunctions at the time, and published in many Vietnamese newspapers in Quốc ngữ, or the modern Vietnamese language, most notably in the Saigon-based newspaper Phụ nữ Tân Văn. Here, I'm not making a case against Vietnamese homophobia. I posit that homophobia and transphobia are a humanity problem across spaces and times because they are not limited to a race or a people or a country. However, homophobia and transphobia are often weaponized to discredit non-Western cultures, as Black, brown, and other people of color are associated with regressive politics in the eyes of the Western human rights institution, necessitating Western intervention to save non-Western queers from non-Western homophobes. This international human rights agenda is also dangerous as it sparks the reactionary belief that queerness is a lifestyle imported from the West to destroy non-Western cultures. So, how do we escape this dualistic vision of gay West versus homophobic East and locate queerness within ourselves? Looking back, I had had very little involvement with the Vietnamese queer community. My first and last involvement with them dated back to 2014 when I was a volunteer on the day of the Hanoi Pride Parade. I noticed that one of the festival's anthems was Lady Gaga's Born This Way, which now, when I think about it, is actually a clever use of Western pop culture material to not only argue against the idea that being LGBTQ was a Western import, but also to move the conversation towards the affirmation of a cultural authenticity of Vietnamese queerness. I believe that the essence of queer is rooted in ambiguity, and queer is a flexible space for the expression of non-normative culture production in Vietnam. Queer doesn't have to be exclusively a Western construct, even though its linguistic and academic origins are deep-seated in Western erected fields of feminist and queer studies. In the context of Vietnam, there are some queer elements rooted in folklore, but unfortunately do not capture the present-day reality of queerness. For example, slang terms to describe a homosexual such as đồng cô or bóng are borrowed from the practices of mediumship and spiritism, yet I think Vietnamese queer identities are much more than just references to spirits or mediums. Politics and culture are involving concepts and practices, and it's legitimate for Vietnamese queers to find other words to define themselves. The first appearance of the term same-sex love in a Vietnamese dictionary dated back in the 1930s with the publication of lexicographer Đào Duyen's Từ điển Hán Việt, or the Han Vietnamese Dictionary. In this dictionary, same-sex love, or đồng tính luyến ái in Vietnamese, shares almost the same semantic as its Chinese word đồng xuyên ái, which from my understanding carries an offensive meaning. Đào Duyen defines đồng tính luyến ái as con trai yêu con trai, con gái yêu con gái, or boy loves boy, girl loves girl, and even includes its French meaning, which is amour homosexuel between parentheses. Now, the mainstream queer culture in Vietnam has expanded and matured over the past decade. Pride festivals take place annually from north to south, and many advocacy projects are enthusiastically sponsored by foreign NGOs and embassies to promote the international human rights agenda. The Vietnamese LGBTQ community also appropriates Western LGBTQ terminology and translates it into Vietnamese to adapt to the local cultural and linguistic context and use. Terms such as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender become gay, les or let in the colloquial register, song tính, and chuẩn, giới. The adoption and appropriation of Western LGBTQ glossary is an interesting parallel to the use of Lady Gaga's Born This Way at Hanoi Pride in 2014, as the Vietnamese LGBTQ community finds inspirations from external sources to label itself, advocate for LGBTQ rights, and reclaim a version of cultural authenticity for the existence of queerness in the country, which had long been hidden in plain sight, and whose existence had not been evoked semantically in modern terms. However, we need to be cautious of the imposition of Western concepts of sexuality and gender onto Vietnamese queer realities. In his 2002 article, Reorienting Desire, Arab history professor Joseph Massad cautions us about the use of Western discourse on sexuality in the context of non-Western civilizations and explains how this discourse serves as a tool for Western imperialism to enforce its agenda into the local understanding of queerness. This imposition of Western concepts and practices is what Professor Massad calls the Gay International, whose main aim is to spread its international human rights agenda through the granting of foreign aid to local LGBTQ NGOs in order to give birth to and shape local LGBTQ politics according to Western standards. In the Vietnamese context, the main sponsors of local LGBTQ projects and events have been the Swedish, American, and Canadian embassies, along with many other foreign NGOs, and you can read more about the attempts at directing Vietnamese LGBTQ actions in Natalie Newton's dissertation here. With this in mind, I can see that it is unfair of me to impose a Westocentric theoretical and linguistic framework, which is queer theory in this video. What I'm proposing in my analysis is one among many other ways to challenge the queers are from the West and Vietnamese queers are oppressed dichotomy. And hopefully, more research from Vietnamese queer scholars using an indigenous Vietnamese framework will be conducted in the future if we ever manage to escape the weight of Westocentric knowledge. In my observation, the oral transmission of Vietnamese myths and legends is very gendered and heterocentric. However, I have noticed that in arts, there seems to be much more freedom of representation of these myths, which opens the door to transgression. To back up my argument, I chose the examples of mediumship in Đạo Mẫu, Cải Lương, and Múa Đánh Bông, and argue that they allow for gender transgression because their practices allow men and women to behave outside of their prescribed gender roles, even within the confines of gender and sexuality norms in Vietnam. The first example of Vietnamese queerness can be found in the religion of Đạo Mẫu, which is a fusion of local Vietnamese folk beliefs, Taoism, and Buddhism. Đạo Mẫu followers worship goddesses who are believed to have created rivers, mountains, and many other things in the universe. They don't only worship goddesses of nature, but also woman figures who make up the backbone of Vietnamese national myths, such as Âu Cơ, Hai Bà Trưng, Princess Liễu Hạnh, or Bà Triệu, whose tales are passed down generations to generations through oral stories. The religion is most known for its spirit possession ritual, which is called Lên Đồng or Hầu Đồng. While the majority of mediums are women, men can also be mediums, and in general, all mediums are expected to perform the ritual beautifully, regardless of the gender of the spirit. Male and female spirits have their own musical melody, costumes, and characteristics, and during the ceremony, the spirit is incarnated in the medium's body as the medium burns incense and dances to traditional music. Interestingly, the cult of Trần Hưng Đạo, which I explored in my last video, is incorporated into Đạo Mẫu, as he is one of the many spirits that can possess a medium's body, along with the spirits of goddesses, ladies, mandarins, and princes. Trần Hưng Đạo spirit is believed to suppress evil and bring fortune to the people, and he can be incarnated in a female medium's body, hence allowing a female medium to perform male gender roles. Another example of queerness in Vietnamese culture can be seen in performing arts, specifically cải lương. And I use the 2018 film Song Lang, directed by Leon Lê, to illustrate my point. Cải lương is a type of Vietnamese folk opera having its origins in southern Vietnam. In the 20th century, it was very popular amongst the working class due to its affordability, its reenactment of popular Vietnamese myths and legends, and its mise en scène of many aspects of Vietnamese society. Cải lương performers are expected to wear costumes representing different historical figures or characters, which sometimes can lead to the blurring of gender. Male cải lương performers have to apply makeup, as we can see here in this excerpt of Song Lang, in which the main character plays the role of Trọng Thủy in the reenactment of the Mỹ Châu and Trọng Thủy myth. Although the myth features a heterosexual couple in a gendered context, the freedom of artistic representation makes room for the contestation of gender and sexuality norms through costume play and gender blurring makeup. The final example is Múa Đánh Bồng, which is a ceremony native to the village of Chiều Khúc in Hanoi. According to oral tradition, Phùng Hưng, a Vietnamese king in the 8th century, united his troops in Chiều Khúc village to launch an attack on the Tang dynasty's forces. In order to better prepare for the battle and motivate his men, he ordered the soldiers to disguise as women, wear feminine clothes, and dance to the sounds of drums. This tradition has been upheld by many generations of Chiều Khúc villagers, as the dance has upbeat sounds and melodies of an actual battle, yet retaining its intrinsic graciousness in a gender-bending performance. Male performers must be unmarried at the time of the ritual, have good education, and wear makeup and women's clothes, thus creating space for men to perform female gender roles. Even though queer is a Western concept, and I have repeatedly reminded my audience throughout this video of the limits of my argument due to the use of Western knowledge to analyze queerness in Vietnamese culture, I still think that queer has a radical potential. Particularly, it has the potential to help us research our own Vietnamese queer history through the rediscovery of our folklore and traditions. By critically engaging with Western scholarship on queerness, not only do we question the heteronymy of gender and sexuality, in addition to the racist and imperialist facets of the Western knowledge institution, but we also examine different modes of cultural production within our own culture and beyond the boundaries of our culture. Perhaps this is a way not to take our queer history for granted in order to create space for learning and resistance, as seen through the Vietnam Queer History Month project, which has been recurring since 2017, to document past and present written and oral queer history in Vietnam. Thank you for watching this video and listening to my thoughts. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below, and please subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Cheerio!